Welcome! A couple of weeks ago I made a video showing you how to make these super swirly textured pots. I made this one and this one as an example. And some of you asked how you're going to glaze it, so that's what I'm going to do today. In general, when you have very textured pots like this, I recommend that you use some glaze that breaks well over these edges. And when we talk about breaking, it's about whether the glaze change color a lot when it's thicker or thinner. Because when you have textured surfaces like this, it will run off a little bit on the higher points and it will pool down in the deeper points. So if you have a glaze that change color a lot, when that happens, it will look beautiful on a pot like this. One of my favorite glazes for that is the floating blue. There's exist a lot of different variations of it. I use one that I think assembles or look like the one that Old Force made, where the red iron oxide is exchanged for manganese. So it becomes a little more purplish in the breaking instead of brown. I like that. But there's so many other variations, and you can see them all on glazing.org. Another one that I like is Folk Art Gilt White. It also have some beautiful breakage, and it's more between white and this iron brownish color. They're both really good. But today I'm going to use my, I think, all-time favorite, the floating blue, and it actually gave me some challenges lately with this last batch, because there's a lot of Ghostly Barat in it, and if you ever made glazes with Ghostly Barat, you know that it tends to gel up a little bit. And to combat that, the natural thing would just be to add more water, but then it becomes too watery. The specific gravity, the relation between dry materials and water, comes out of proportion. So instead, to make it more fluid, you can add a deflucant. I use sodium silicate. You can also use Darwin 11, I think it's called. But you know, sodium silicate is widely available and very cheap. But then it sort of became too watery. Then of course I could combat that by adding some Epsom salt. But yeah, well, it's a constant battle. And I have very little left, so I'm just going to use it. I know now, by experience, that I just need to dip it a few more times. And that's what I would usually do with a glaze like this. However, as you see, there's very little left and not enough for dipping. So instead, we're going to pour it over. And but before we do that, I do, as I always do, clean the pots. Because even though they do look clean, there could be some dust or something left, and any particles that are left on your pot before you glaze can somehow alter the glaze in a not so pleasant way. Of course, with heavy textures like this, it's not that easy to clean it, but I mean, do it the best you can. It is a good idea to get all those dust particles away. So I think we did good with this one. The other one here is a little more easy, because even though it's textured, the surface is not as extreme as the first one. So now we're ready for glazing. Remember always when you take out your glaze to stir it well. If it's been sitting for a long time, maybe you also want to sieve it. You don't want any lumps of dry material. But this one I used yesterday, so it's fine and ready. I will start by glazing the inside first. And I do that by pouring. Let me just get this. I'm just going to put it into this. Is it clean? Just want to make sure. Yeah, there's just some dust in it. I'm just going to pour the glaze into this pitcher, like this, and then pour it into my pot. swirl it around. And now I know, because as I said, this glaze got a little bit too thin and actually needs a very thick layer. So I'm actually going to do it 2 times, which I usually wouldn't do with this glaze, but the way it is right now, that's what we need. So I'm going to give it good time. I'm going to pour it out. And then I'll just let it dry a little bit and give it another go. Same thing with the small one. So pour it in, swirl it around a little bit. Actually, give it a lot of time. It's important when you work with your glazes to know how thick a layer it should have. This one needs a very thick layer. The Fogart Gilt white, it's a little bit different, because if it's too thin, it becomes completely brown. If it's too thick, it becomes completely white. And so that's the tricky part about that glaze. So so now this needs to dry a little bit more, and then I'm going to do the second round. Now I think it's dry enough for the second coat. And as I said, this is because it have been too watery, become too watery. This glaze that I'm giving it a double coat. Usually I keep it a lot thicker. In that case, I don't need to double coat it, but I just want to make sure that we get enough, because the floating blue becomes, well, brownish, almost black, if it's too thin of a layer, and I really don't like that. So just gonna swirl it around a little bit, make sure that it's soaking into the clay. Oh, so I think that's good enough. I'm not so concerned about any dripping on the outside, because I'm gonna give it the same glaze on the outside in just a moment. And the other one. It's always a bit tricky when you do this. You want it to go all the way to the edge, but of course you don't want it to spill over the edge. It takes a little bit of practice, but I think it's going okay. See, it's close to the edge, but not too much on the table. Now we're ready to do the outside. And as I mentioned, I would usually just dip these ones. I do have a little bit of a foot here, so I could be careful and dip it like this, but there's just not enough glaze. A trick, if you don't have that much glaze left, you can pour it over into a smaller bucket. Let's say something like this. And because it's smaller, it would be a higher level, and it could be enough. But in this case, I just don't have enough glaze, even for a smaller one. And I mean, it can't be any smaller than the width of this one. For this one, it may work, but since I have to do both of them anyway, I think I'm going to do something different. And that is just pouring it over. And doing that, you need to have something to hold on to. And in this case, I do have a little bit of a foot, so it is possible. It's not that easy, but if you turn your hands around like this and you start pouring, you will be able to pour it a whole round if you're lucky. I think I am. I'm just gonna let it drip a little bit and then turn it around and put it aside. Just like the inside, I think I will have to do 2 coats of this in order to get it thick enough. So the second one is a little more difficult to hold on to. I may have to do it in 2 rounds. difficult to hold on to. You need good powers in your fingers to do this. I think it works. I'm gonna finish the foot after I'm done with this. So now it just needs to dry a little bit so I can do the second coat. Now it's dry enough for me to touch. That's good enough. So we can do a second coat on the outside. Just let it drip off. You don't want too much drips hanging on on the edge of the bowl, but that looks good. You may notice that there's a little bit of empty spot here on the rim. I will finish that in a second after it dries. The same thing with the second one. Now we're going to let that dry again. It's a lot of waiting. It actually pays off when you do things like this to have 10, 15 pots or something, because then you can do the inside, and then the first ones are going to be dry when you do the last ones. But in this case, I just had these two, so we'll have to wait. And your table, yeah, it does get messy, but make sure you clean it, because then when you put your pots here, you're not gonna get glaze on the bottom. So try and keep your table clean. Like this. As I mentioned, there's a little bit of empty spots. I don't know if you can see it here. Some empty spots around the rim where I didn't get glaze, because I poured inside and tried to get it high as possible, and I poured outside. So there's some pieces where I don't have any glaze. But what I will do is I'm just gonna dip it with my brush. And in this case, for this glaze, it doesn't matter that it runs down. It's actually quite good. Because it does give different colors for different layers, and with this glaze, as I think I mentioned a few times, it can never be too thick. So actually letting it run down here can create some really nice variations. So just something like this. I'm probably gonna do another coat of the rim when it dries up a little bit, and gonna do the same thing with the other one. Just splashing it on. Not actually painting it, because if I was painting it, I would remove what is already there. So I'm sort of like I don't know, spotting it on something. And as you see, it will run down the sides, but in my experience, that can actually look really good. So you see, it runs down like this, but I'm not afraid of that for this glaze. So now we let it dry a little bit more, and when it's dry enough to really touch, I can move on with the foot, and then start with the extra colors that I'm gonna add. Cleaning, cleaning, cleaning. Now this is dry enough to touch, so I still have to be very careful not to scratch it off or anything. But what I want to do is, I want to make sure, of course, that there's no glaze at the bottom. Just going to make sure that's very clean, because otherwise, of course, it's going to stick to the kiln shelves. I don't want that. So I actually don't mind that there's a very, very small layer of glaze on the rim, because as I mentioned, with this glaze, when it's very thin, it becomes almost black, and I think that will look nice for this particular pot. So I'm just going to take off the fat part of the layer, so to speak, because that's another thing you have to keep in mind with these textured pots of any kind, is that because the glaze pools down, not so much on this one, a little more on the other one, it also tends to run a little bit more, because they're going to be very thick layers in the lower parts of the texture. And this particular glaze is not bad when it comes to running. Some glazes are a lot worse. So you need to know your glaze when you're dealing with textured pots, because otherwise you'll all end up on your kiln shelves. And we don't want that. So now, as you see, I'm actually adding back just a very little, very thin layer of glaze on the outside of the rim. It is most likely going to be just very dark, but it will produce the color of this, well, buffy kind of clay. It's not that interesting color. So now I've got it cleaned inside, and this is so thin on the foot that it won't run. So now this is clean, and this is where you need to be absolutely sure that your table is clean too, otherwise going to smudge it up again. So just going to turn this around and let it dry a little bit more. On the inside of the bowl, I'm going to do what I've done on so many. I'm going to add a bit of white, drag it up the sides. I'm going to add some oxides. So let's move on with that. I will, as usual, be using my favorite white, the Heath A2V white. It blends really well with this floating blue, and I'm just going to take a little bit in this pitcher and pour it inside, and have to be a little bit careful that it doesn't drip, because I don't want it on the edges. Like this, and then I'm just gonna splash it up the sides. Something like this should be good. I'm gonna do the same thing to the other one. Just gonna use a little bit less. Also going to splash it up the sides. Something like this. Looks a little bit chaotic now, but it should be fine. Now the little one have dried enough for me to apply the oxides. And as usual, I'm going to use a little bit of copper carbonate wash. So it's basically just copper carbonate, and it's dissolved in water and becomes very watery. So I'm going to splash some of that on the inside. Like that. And then I'm going to add some of the cobalt. This is actually a cobalt stain wash. So it's not pure cobalt oxides. It's probably even stronger, but this is good too. But using it on the inside is safe, but it also makes it very runny. So I'm careful not to use it too much on the outside. And if I do, I only put it on the upper parts. So that's it. And then a little bit of red iron oxide wash. So that's it, ready to fire. And now the same thing with the other one. A little bit of the nice green copper carbonate brush. Some of the cobalt. And a little bit of the iron oxide. It's almost like mixing a dish or something. So this is ready for file 2. So now it becomes exciting. Just gonna put it in the kiln and fire it, and in a day or 2 I'll show the result. I will show it to you if it's good, but if it fails, I'll also show it to you. So I'll see you in a few moments. Good morning. Now the kiln have finished the glaze fire and I'm ready to unload it. And as always, I'm super excited. And I know I said this many times before, but please remember to let the kiln cool down enough. If you open it too early, there's a risk that the glazes will crackle and be distorted in some way. But also, maybe even more important, if you open it when it's too hot, you put a lot of stress on your heating elements, and they won't last as long, and they're expensive to change. So please wait. Anyway, if it's too warm, you can't handle the pots anyway. So now it's about 50 degrees and it's perfect to open. So let's go and see what it looks like. That turned out almost exactly the way I wanted. Let's take a closer look. Even at 50 degrees, they still feel a little bit too hot to handle by hand. But look, inside is just perfect. I really, really love this combination. The outside does show signs of what I was talking about when I glazed it, that you can see it could actually have been thicker. So I do have a formulation issue with the last part of this glaze. But on the inside, I clearly got enough of a layer. And it's not that I don't like it on the outside. It's just, it could have been a little bit more thick, but it's okay. And if you look at the foot here, I did manage to get just a bit of a taint, so you don't leave this sort of dull, buffy clay. So this, I think, turned out pretty well. I was a little more lucky with this one on the outside. As you can see, it breaks so much. So where the high part of the texture is, it's almost just the buff clay color, very light, and then it becomes deeper in the deeper areas. So it highlights the textures a lot. And also I got, the foot just a little bit tainted with the glaze. And the inside, of course, again, looks great. Maybe I will use this for a plant or something. So now the color on the inside is not that important. But anyway, I made it. So that was not such a long video, but just want to show you how I glaze these ones. And of course, you could use other glazes. These are just some of my favorites. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, share, comment, whatever you like. And I hope to see you again next week, next Sunday, when I will have another video coming up, usually around 5 p.m. Central European time. So have a great day.